So welcome to DesignOps Island Discs, the podcast from Zero Height that navigates the calm waters of DesignOps with your host, me, Luke Murphy. I'm a design advocate at Zero Height, and I'm talking to the best folks in DesignOps and design systems to navigate us through what it takes to float DesignOps and design systems within your org. So for episode 4 of season 3, which is being recorded live, I'm joined by Heydon Pickering. So as we know, this season, we're focusing on the roles within design systems, and Heydon is here as a front-end developer on design systems, but that's not all that Heydon does. Heydon is also a designer, technical writer, editor, author, illustrator. I'm sure I'm forgetting something there, but it's okay. We'll cover it off later. He wrote the book Inclusive Components and has worked with the Paciello Group, Spotify, BBC, Smashing Mag, Bulb Energy, and most recently Springer Nature. He is one of the front-end developers on the design system. So welcome to the podcast, Heydon.
Hello, thank you for having me. Yeah, I don't think you forgot anything. I ski, I cook, I'm in a band. Basically, I'm 40 and I don't have children. So I have.
I was going to say, is there also maybe undiagnosed ADHD? Because I know that's definitely my problem.
Actually, there is a lot of people with ADHD or who are neurodivergent have told me that I might be that way inclined. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
I think that there is just a relatively high proportion of people within design systems and sort of front end that definitely sit on the neurodivergent spectrum. But yeah, I mean, we could just spend the whole podcast talking about that if you want.
Oh, sure.
But I suppose we should.
Yeah, I'm certainly comfortable talking about it. If it comes up, it comes up. That's all good. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we should probably get back to design systems because that's what people have bought their ticket for, right?
Yeah.
So today we're focusing on one of those many things that you do, which is the front end dev experience or the engineer experience or whatever it is that you want to call it within design systems, which is one of the many roles you've had. But I suppose what led you into sort of design systems in the first place? How did you get to design systems?
I've been trying to work that out. And I think most of my recent work with design systems, with organizations with design systems, has been through the route of accessibility. So I think a lot of folks associate me with accessibility before they do anything else, perhaps accessibility and then maybe sort of CSS stuff. And usually it would be the case that there'd be already a design system that they were maintaining that was in existence and was relative level of maturity, and they'd want some specific advice regarding accessibility. And a lot of the work I had done previously was very much focused around accessibility, as in doing like audits and providing what's called remediation advice, which is a really kind of esoteric word, but just basically, here's how you fix it. Like you need to change this code or you need to move this into this place or what have you.
It's the list of shit to fix, right?
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
a nice word.
Yeah. So with the Paciello Group and other folks like that, it's a case of a lot of people just kind of run automated tests and just say, well, these are all the things that are broken, and then you get a list of like 7 million missing image alt attributes or whatever. The idea was to move it towards being organized around components more, just because we were meeting developers halfway there, because we knew that they would be working kind of on a component basis rather than on a image alt text basis. You're not going to do all of those in one go. You're going to be working on a component. And so that was one of the things we moved towards doing, is organizing around components in our sort of the solutions we were providing. And I guess that's where it started to become system-like or became reminiscent of how design systems are organized with your component libraries and things like that. But as organizations would ask, I'd come in as a consultant and I would be asked to go through their design system and just give them advice on making their components more accessible, really. Although it was an interesting situation, because I had a few times what happened was that I'd be asked to come in and do accessibility stuff with their design system, but then it would end up being the case that because they were an organization full of full stack developers, and by full stack developer, I mean someone who knows how like complex database stuff works and knows how to write JavaScript, but is not really familiar at all with HTML or CSS. So we get into the sort of, there was a lot of the back of the front end people, but not a lot of the front of the front end people.
Front of the front end.
Yep. So it would be kind of like a case of, we want you to do accessibility for us. And then it would be like, actually, since you're here, how does Flexbox work? You know, so it was literally the case in naming no names, but that was literally the case in one place. It's like, we do have these objectives and OKRs and things to meet in terms of accessibility, but also we need to do a layout. And nobody, you know, people are like really good at React, and they were getting up to speed with TypeScript and things like that. Stuff that sort of makes my head spin, if I'm honest. But Flexbox and Grid and things like that, not so hot. So in a way, that's how I segued from just being a specific accessibility consultant that was brought to bear on design systems to someone who just works generally as a front-end developer in design systems, I guess. Yeah.
Do you find that sort of engineering front end, basically the engineer experience within design systems definitely does weigh towards that front end sort of skill set?
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting thing about design systems. I think it's the current home for people who aren't necessarily like full-on JavaScript programmers, if you sort of mean.
Yeah.
People who have a broader skill set, I think, a skill set which incorporates a lot of different things anyway. And because there's so many facets to design systems. And I mean, I know folks who are really talented who work on design systems a lot. And it's mostly, I think, because unless you're working on the design system these days, you're not really, with that skill set, there's little room for you in the industry. I mean, that shouldn't be the case, but with so much emphasis on the sort of computer sciencey elements of it, it's difficult to find a foothold otherwise. So yeah, so it feels like a sort of natural home to me, because it's somewhere that I can think about CSS and HTML and accessibility all in one place. The front end stuff. Yeah,
because it's I suppose that's the thing, is that it's not only the place where you can kind of focus on that, but you can actually think about the best way to implement. Because I know that it's definitely something that I found is I feel like it's the curse of startups where they only want to hire full stack because it's easier that way, and it's cheaper because you get somebody who can do all of it.
Yeah.
When the reality is, a lot of the, as you said, like the full stack people tend to veer towards the back of the front end, I suppose, because they need that skill set, right? But it means that a lot of their front end skills are very much it's to get the job done.
Yeah.
Not necessarily get the job done right.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think for the most part, the term full stack is kind of a misnomer. There are people out there who are really great at CSS and really great at like GraphQL stuff and things like that. But they are few and far between. And full stack usually means I'm really good at that computer science element. Like, I know JavaScript inside out. I know how to build complex APIs and things like that. And I've heard of CSS, you know, it's like that combination.
Yeah, there is a reason. There is a reason why we used to call full stackers unicorns, because they didn't actually, true full stackers didn't exist. Right?
Yeah, but where it's actually a balance between the different skill sets. Yeah, very rare, I think. Yeah,
exactly. And I think that's really interesting that and it does, it obviously makes sense that design systems feels like a really good home for the front enders, especially because, what you're focusing on is serving up a lot lot of it is serving up front end elements and not necessarily like hooking it up. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I do love writing JavaScript. I always tell people I actually really like JavaScript. I just don't like other people's JavaScript, which is why I try and avoid like frameworks and things quite a lot as well. I'm really one of the nice things at Springer Nature, where Amy and I are at the moment, is that the design system is very much built around the underlying standards. So if there's some JavaScript in there, it's vanilla JavaScript. It's not dependent on React or something like that. And it's just as and when you need it, kind of thing. The assumption is that you're going to be creating a server rendered or statically built site, and which will need some behavior perhaps, and so it's sort of it's peppered with a little bit of JavaScript, which is the way that I like it, I suppose. But it's also working with React and TypeScript, like that particular combination. I've consulted with companies where they have that sort of setup, and I just find it really arduous to work in that way. When TypeScript's complaining at you because you've put an ARIA attribute on something. And it's like, well, I know this is right, and I know it's a string because it's an HTML attribute, but you're saying it's not typed properly. So then I have to go and ask someone who understands how TypeScript works, and it's like it sort of unnecessarily impedes you in doing what you already know is going to be making the actual output, the HTML, more accessible or just better. I don't want to. This could easily become a I hate TypeScript kind of soapbox. But yeah, I like things to be really pared down, standards based, and flexible, I suppose. And we've got a good kind of setup there for that. And the only thing I would if I were to start thinking in terms of encapsulated components and things, I would naturally, as you might imagine, then start thinking more in the direction of web components, which I've used. I've used a few times, and I don't know if people realize how well supported web components are now and how cool they are to work with. They are actually really kind of fun, because you kind of have to do a lot of the nitty gritty. There's not a lot there already done for you, but that's what I like about them. They're not so much a black box. And I find that a lot of the technologies we use, things like, I don't know, like Webpack and things, like I can't hold all of it in my head at once. One thing, like a neurodivergent point, I have very limited executive functioning, I think it's called. So if I'm presented by a complex JavaScript compiler, and there's no way I'll be able to understand it. Just in the same way that if I'm presented with like a parking meter, there's no way I can understand that. It's just too many functions and things at once, if you see what I mean. And it's trying to piece them together and try and understand it all simultaneously. Yeah, I can't hold that much in my brain at one time. I'm very methodical, one thing at a time. And I don't know, web components feel a bit like that, because you have very little, and then you can just do little things to move them in the right direction, rather than start with a load of boilerplate. And I mean, famously, obviously, with a lot of those frameworks, the boilerplate itself, just to get it up and running without you even writing a hello world, you're already looking at like 800 kilobyte page or something. So it's sort of distasteful from a performance point of view too. So, yeah.
I mean, I remember the heady days where you'd use a boilerplate that literally had, an HTML file, a CSS file, and a JavaScript file, and that was it.
Yeah.
It's and now start up a React and a React app, and Jesus, you've got about 500 files just waiting for you there, staring at you, going, "You know what to do with me, right?" So
yeah.
So it's interesting actually. I think that's I was chatting to Brad. I think it was on season 2. Brad Frost about this. He was saying that web components is like, that's his jam when it comes to design systems these days, and he doesn't really sort of go anywhere else.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine Brad liking them because it's standards and I mean, the other thing, which of course is really interesting, or is really cool about them, I suppose, is just that they're more compatible with more things. I know there's a specific word for that, but I'm just going to say more compatible with more things. As in, like because they are just the underlying standard technology, you don't have to bring everybody on board to them. You can just give them it's just JavaScript. It's just JavaScript and HTML. Here you go, and you can put it inside your React application if they're consuming. Let's say you've got a team with multiple. You've got a company with multiple teams. One of them might be using React, one might be using Vue, and you can put web components in each of those contexts. So like when I did some work not so long ago with the BBC, with BBC's Gel, my job essentially, and I was working with a fantastically wonderful, extremely neurodivergent team as well within the BBC there. And my job was basically to take all of the kind of high level Gel guidance, which is kind of high level design stuff, not really code or technical stuff, and convert it, both provide technical advice very much from a standpoint of accessibility, but also to implement these things and actually write the code to make them work. And it was just as APIs like intersection observer and mutation observer were coming out, so you could start doing really cool componenty stuff, but directly in your like vanilla plain JavaScript. And so that was a fun thing to do, to take all of those BBC components and actually get them running, I suppose, but in that way but someone in say BBC News, they might take that component and they might use that. They could use it directly inside what's already, I don't know what they use in BBC News, but inside what might already be a React, code base, or they could take kind of the documentation for it, and the way that it's set out and the way that the states and the properties and everything are described, and make a React component, so it's just a lot more reusable and flexible, I guess.
Yeah. No, I think that makes complete sense. So I suppose I'm gonna, just do a quick whiplash turn now. In terms of, well, actually, it's going back. So going back, we were talking about the fact that front end is clearly one set of skills that works well with folks on design systems. When you're coming in as an engineer on there. Do you think there's anything else that makes a good design systems engineer or like front ender?
Well, we touched on it very briefly earlier, but I think it's worth expanding on. I think that it's more of a communication and coordination job than it is a code job. So if you're working in product, you are kind of valued based on how, like specifically how performant and well-designed and powerful your code is. With design systems and being a front-end developer or being any kind of developer in that context, I think it's a lot more to do with trade-offs and compromises around getting those things adopted, getting those components or those like higher level rules and things adopted. So I think you need to, first of all, just generally, I think you need to be a systems thinker. I mean, the clue's in the name, I guess, design system, but actually care about how the different dots join up. So you can't have that kind of mindset of, here's a Jira ticket or a Jira story or whatever you want to call it, and you just tick it off. You have to constantly be thinking about the system as a whole and the knock-on effects that what you do might have. I mean, I had a classic thing recently where I kind of forgot to think in that way, where we were talking about changing the like the vertical rhythm, like just the flow content spacing, the block spacing, and doing that across multiple brands in an organization and in a large organization. And I thought, well, I'm good at CSS. I can do this just with very, very non-specific selectors in a very basic style sheet, like really high up in the cascade. And then that will filter down, and it'll be overridden by certain things and what have you anyway. And it worked, as in it really, it filtered through, and all of these different places suddenly had this this new set of spacing, so that like headings and paragraphs and things were spaced differently. The trouble, of course, was that a whole massive organization of people were like, whoa, wait a second, these things look different. And of course you have to then explain, no, they're supposed to. But it's bearing in mind that it's the messaging. It's you can't just get in there and fix stuff or change stuff. It's about making sure that people are they are, what's the term? They're involved. You know, they're included in the conversation.
But informed as well, even like at a minimum, right?
Warned, I think, is one way of putting it. Well,
I suppose because it is one of those things where it's like, I mean, I know that it's not particularly popular at the moment to refer to your design system as a product, but it's like if we do take that view that a design system is a product, it's it's the same as if you've got a commercial product and you're releasing it to the public. You inform them of changes, you do a change, and also you are mindful of the changes that you're making and make sure that you're getting feedback and having that loop. Because I mean, I've definitely done it in the past where I've released a new UI to millions of people, got really bad backlash, and then had everybody internally being like, what are you doing? Actually, with a little bit of communication, that probably could have been avoided quite easily.
It's like, managing expectations, basically, isn't it? Yeah, I think most of the time, you're not going to get people who are going to say, no, this is all wrong. This is hurting my eyes. You need to stop this. They're just going to be offended if they're not consulted, basically. Oh, that's the word I was trying to think of, consulted. Yeah. So there's that, but I think also, generally like soft skills, and I hate the term soft skills because they're hard. Like the soft skills are actually harder than the other skills. I did a talk a long time ago, and I used the expression, there are no Booleans in human interaction. And I stand by that. Like that's actually like, it's held up as being this really difficult and rarefied thing to be a really good programmer, but things like Booleans are really dependable, obvious, easy things. As soon as you get, once you've got around the silly terminology like Boolean, but you don't get that.
But no,
and what
the binary is easy. The binary is easy, like that is, and it's like nothing in real life is binary. So
exactly, and so your communication skills have to be really, really strong as well. I spend more of my time writing documentation than I do making components. That's been less the case recently because we have quite a young and design system which is growing quite fast. But generally speaking, my consultancy work is basically, can you write the documentation for these components? Also, can you build these components? So it's kind of documentation first, which is, I kind of like a documentation first approach to things, actually. Kind of like, like test-driven development, documentation-driven development, I like the idea of. And something
man, after my own heart.
But actually, I like the writing part. Most people are like, oh, now I've got to write about it. But I like writing. I like communicating. I like writing blog posts and narrating videos and that sort of that. Those are sort of, if they weren't things which were related to my career, I would do them as a hobby anyway. But I think that's sort of rare to some extent. Not necessarily because I think that programmers or coders are naturally not inclined to write or don't enjoy writing, but actually I think it's just because there's so much emphasis on their value being around churning out the code itself that they're anxious to get into the coding. Like the more time I'm writing documentation, the less time I'm impressing my boss with how good my code is. So so that
I feel like it's a very similar problem that a lot of design have as well, where it's the time that a good product designer, especially the more senior you go and the more impact that you start having, the less time you'll actually spend, doing things in Figma. It's more around, communicating, researching, basically doing a lot of the groundwork and doing the work to like socialize. Hey, God, punch me for my business terminology, but
to
socializing what
socialize
you're
the,
doing.
I see what you mean.
Yeah. And getting like and writing the documentation, actually, writing down the decisions that you're making and why, and backing them up and having all of that kind of stuff. It's the crux of your job, right? And I think it's the same with a lot of, but it's one of those things that you almost feel like you're not really working if you're not, churning out code or churning out designs, churning out assets.
And actually, like starting with tests, like, so you write the sort of the test first, if you like, so you know what you're looking for. I think that works with writing documentation too. If you're setting out in your documentation how the component works, or how the whatever the code is works, then that's leading you down the right path, hopefully. Certainly I find that for me, like I've written books before where I didn't really know the subject until I wrote the book. It's only in writing it that you're forced to research it properly, right?
Isn't that's the best way to learn anything, is to try and teach somebody else.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, absolutely, because then you're kind of using them as a soundboard in a way. Yeah.
Would you say, I mean, so on that documentation, you're saying that is, also a relatively rare, the desire to document as well, and to be able to do it well is relatively rare within engineering. Would you say that is something that is a bit missing within design system teams at the moment, sort of from an engineering perspective?
I do think that, and I know Amy will agree with me on this. I think that design systems what we call design systems tend to veer towards just being catalogs of things which have already been designed, or of, components which are just there. And not enough emphasis, therefore, is around the guidance or the way we should be making things. So, like a system, like the term system means both an existing thing that has internal logic and parts that move and internal relationships and interdependencies, but it's also a set of rules for going about things, right? And I like to think of design systems way more in the second sense of it being more, not so much what's available, what you've done, how things have been done, but more principles for moving forward and making things in the future. I mean, that's maybe a fairly kind of pedestrian point, but I do think that a lot of people get that wrong, where it's more just, there's not a lot of governance, and it's just really just a depot where you leave the stuff that you've made, whether it's good or bad, I was going to say repository, but then I thought that would get confused specifically with GitHub repositories. But yeah, just a dumping ground for things. And I do think that folks get that wrong.
Well, it is. I suppose it goes into that whole like, I don't know, seeing design systems as infrastructure, right? Is a good way. I like to think of viewing it, because it's not only thinking about, well, it's not only viewing it not as a product and something that can be thrown away and something that you MVP and like all of that kind of stuff, and something that can be deprioritized, but seeing it as, this is business stakes, but also because this is business stakes, this is something that is, business critical, I should say. Because this is business critical, we need to think about what we're putting in there, and we need to think about the way that it operates, and we need to think about the shape of it and everything that happens, because it's a piece of infrastructure that makes the rest of the product and the rest of the business work. I don't know, that's it's definitely the way I like to see it, but I don't think it's a very I don't think that's I don't know, I was going to say I don't think it's a very popular way to view it, but
I think with a lot of things it's from the attitude of the kind of higher ups or the stakeholders, the people who want a design system, it's no more complex a decision-making process than other people have this thing called a design system. I think we should have one.
Yeah.
And what they mean is they mean a site which shows their stuff. So that's the documentation for the design system, right? And I think that's another thing that we get wrong often, is we conflate those two things. The kind of public-facing site, which catalogs all of the things in the design system, whether that's the guidance or the actual code, we conflate that with the working system, the living thing that is tended to constantly. The thing that website is really just about, I suppose. Yeah.
The artifacts, right? It's I know that's something that Amy's talked about a lot, is, you know, we need to stop just looking at design systems as a series of artifacts. So
yeah, I think as a sort of rule of thumb, I think a healthy design system is one where a lot of it is actually intangible rather than you know, out of the box things which you can actually point at and use. Yeah.
That's it. I'm aware that we are getting close to the time where we have to switch it over, but I just want to keep talking because my question's very important.
Well, you have the privilege of being the presenter to ask the first question.
Exactly. I can say when we turn it over to the questions. I suppose the one that I did want to cover off before the end, inspired by what we were talking about earlier about front end. I'm wondering do you think that there are any gaps at the moment, or sort of big challenges and problems that we face within design systems from an engineering point of view around that? I'm really curious, especially with the way that we're going into things like automation and, you know, with tokens and setting up pipelines properly and I don't know, other things that may arise from a design systems point of view. I'm curious about like where you see the future going, any challenges you foresee, especially from an engineering point of view.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not clear. I'm very fuzzy. I have to admit about where I see it going, but I do think there will be a tension between what we were just discussing, which is making design systems as much as possible about a sort of principle-driven way of working, the kind of more abstract stuff. There'll be a tension between that and people trying to automate them more and more. So we'll get to a point where there'll be some sort of AI startup will create something, and the idea is that it will just scan your existing website and it will create a component library, and then it will document it, and it will do everything for you.
But will it?
But of course it won't. I mean, do you remember there was something called the Grid or something like that, which was supposed to be
don't even. I still have flashbacks. There's nightmares.
Yeah, but people always jump on it. There's always enough people who go, this is the future. And then based on a lot of promise and very little, I don't know, evidence or direction, these sorts of things get an awful lot of backing and attention, and that makes the people who come up with them famous. And then of course they turn out to be weird, like Ayn Rand fans or something. And it's always the same. I'm not talking about the Grid necessarily, although that may have been the case. But there's bound to be, I mean, partly because, like we were talking about before, people hate writing documentation. There's going to be people working on ways to automate documentation. You already have people who say, of course, you know, I write code that documents itself. Someone said that to me the other recently in a meeting, and I was stunned. But yeah, I think that it's that tension between those two places, like a more human design system and a colder, more automated and kind of less satisfactory, I suppose, in my biased viewpoint on it, way of doing things. I think you can automate a lot of stuff, but you can't automate the important parts of a design system. And I think there will be some very well VC funded attempts to do so, and they will fail in a very embarrassing way, which will be fun to watch at least. So
I'm looking forward to that. I'm just hoping that we have a platform, you know, with what's currently going on with Twitter. I'm hoping we have a platform where we can all vent collectively about it and watch the demise together.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, I'm going to move on to the audience questions, but before I do, I have to ask the very important final question of the podcast, say the official podcast segment. So before we send you off to your desert island, Heydon, you do get to take one piece of music, one book, and one luxury item with you to spend your days in paradise on the desert island with nobody else around.
Oh,
so what are they? So let's start with the piece of music.
Yeah, so I thought about this and I thought, well, am I allowed a song or a whole album?
You can take a whole album if you want to.
Okay, so if it was going to be one song, I think it would have to be The Ecstasy of Gold by Ennio Morricone, just because that's just a really, I don't know, I could just listen to that all day. It's a fantastic piece of music. If it's an album, though, I'll take my favorite psychedelic rock album, which is Dopes to Infinity by Monster Magnet. They're kind of, a lot of people think of them as being, they were kind of put in the bracket of being a stoner rock band, you know?
Yeah.
But actually, they're one of the greatest psychedelic rock bands. They just happen to be kind of heavy in places, a bit more detuned, I suppose. But that album is just peerless, absolutely brilliant, and it is one of those, like, it's really immersive to listen to. So I could forget that I'm stuck on an island starving or whatever.
Sounds perfect. I mean, you might have to go searching around the island for some, I don't know, ayahuasca or something. But what book would you take with you?
Yeah, that's true. So it'd have to be something that I could read more than once, or, you know, I'd be happy reading multiple times. And when I thought about that, I thought that actually only like comics and stuff are the only things that I would go back to and read over and over. And when I was younger, it was Calvin and Hobbes was my favorite. So I would take a big Calvin and Hobbes anthology, like a really thick Calvin and Hobbes.
Yeah, it's still, I mean, it's one of those ones where I've got the final strip printed and on the wall.
Oh, really?
So, yeah, Calvin and Hobbes is definitely a firm favorite.
Oh, nice.
And then luxury item, you get to take one luxury item with you.
Yeah, so I was gonna say I would take a guitar, because that just keeps me occupied, just coming up with riffs and things like that. But actually, more importantly, being stuck on a desert island on my own for I don't know how long, nowhere near a pub, I would like to take some form of like brewing kit, so that I could take like the discarded, already starting to ferment fruits from this island and mix them with hopefully a life supply of sugar, and accelerate the fermentation process, and then just get drunk, listen to stoner rock, read Calvin Hobbes.
That sounds amazing. A lot of desert islands as well have, you know, some, you know, cassava or some kind of like root vegetables, which you can actually use in as a replacement for malt as well.
Okay.
What a lot of African brewers do. So there you go.
That's my fact for the day. That's like, you learn something every day. That's great.
Brilliant. Okay, so let's hand it over to the audience. We've only got about 10 or 15 minutes, but that's okay. We'll get through as many. There are so many good questions. So, you know, afterwards I might just have to send them to you. So
I can't guarantee
that
the good answers will be proportionate to the good questions. we'll see how it goes.
So let's go. Okay, so let's give this a crack. So the first question is from Brett, and
oh dear. Did Luke disappear for everyone else? Okay.
So what do you think holds web components back?
Oh, that's a good one. I like that. There are the whole context of using JSX, where you can more easily and flexibly use complex data and pass that through. The kind of whole state managing thing using complex data in stuff like React or Vue or equivalents makes it, it just makes those things a lot more ergonomic. The other thing that I was looking into recently about web components is, so declarative shadow DOM is a really exciting thing, where without JavaScript, you can still create a shadow root and you can still encapsulate your CSS and do all of that kind of stuff. But the trouble with it is that you can't do the templating part once and then instantiate multiple versions of that shadow DOM or that kind of web component. You have to kind of define the template for each instance. So I think that's unfortunate, and I'm hoping that there'll be some sort of greater reusability that will be incorporated, where you can maybe reference a template with an ID, so that you can take that shadow DOM markup and you can use it in multiple places from one source, like a single source of truth. That would be really cool. Those are the two things that come to mind. But generally, I think they've just had because they were sort of a stop-start thing, where we had one version of them, and then there was, there's problems with this, and then it came out in a different, like the version 1 syntax and everything. That I think people sort of lost faith in it becoming a thing just because of that sort of it stalled sort of release. I guess they are really strong now, but I think they lost a lot of favor because of the way that they kind of came out and then didn't and then did. So
well, I think that's the thing. It's one of those things with a lot of those standards driven, is that the process is very long, and quite often you can be waiting for a long time between releases, which is a shame. But it does feel like everything is just speeding up a lot now.
Yeah, especially CSS, like all of the stuff that you're getting in CSS now. It's amazing.
The new CSS stuff, it makes me so excited.
Yeah, me too. Like,
all right.
Parent selectors, essentially, with the has function. We were told forever that you just wouldn't be possible. Parent selector, no, that's a pipe dream. No, CSS doesn't work like that. And now you've kind of got it.
It's there's some of the stuff that you can do with has now is just, it blows my mind, seeing the things that Andy Bell or actually Jay Tompkins as well from Google, who just does these ridiculous demos using has to create like safe cracking or whatever. But nice. They're beautiful, but they are really powerful. I mean, and of course, everybody's favorite new thing, container queries.
Another good one. Another one we were told probably wouldn't be possible because of vendor saying the performance would be too, and they just found a way of actually because you're specifically declaring containers, that was the way around it. And that was a really clever bit of lateral thinking to go, okay, the performance won't be so bad if we actually get the author to specify exactly where they want to do the containment. And nice.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to click the finish answering button and just hope for the best to see if this actually does.
No,
no, it didn't.
You didn't disappear that time. So that's good.
Yeah, I'm not going to press the question buttons again, but that's okay. We can just keep going with the questions. So we have a good question from Amy, which is surprising considering it's Amy. But how do you? I mean, no disrespect. Amy Hube is amazing. How do you see the responsibility being split between design system teams and product teams when it comes to making sure that the user experience is accessible? So basically, whose responsibility is it?
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, as an accessibility consultant of sorts, or an erstwhile accessibility consultant, I am bound to say the agreed line, which is accessibility is everyone's responsibility, Amy, and you should know that.
but come on, in reality,
I think so. I think, in fairness, we've talked a lot recently about the fact that that a design system shouldn't be expected to provide everything. It should set a precedent, and it should provide key tools and key components and assets and things. And then product teams are likely to develop some stuff, which it's just unavoidable that there's going to be some stuff that they create themselves, which isn't suitable to be back ported to the design system. So to some extent, you're bound to always be working kind of in parallel and slightly orthogonally. But I think the design system's role is to set the precedent and say, the stuff we're providing is accessible. We've tested it. It's not going to cause any of these problems. You should do the same. If you're not actually using our stuff directly, you should be doing the same thing. So I think the role of the design system isn't just to provide components that are accessible, but to set the precedent for how accessibility is done right, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think that makes sense as well, because obviously design system is the one that's going to be thoroughly documented and accessible to everybody in terms of, you know, the what goes around it, which is, you know, where a lot of the accessibility lives. It's, you know, because a lot of what makes something accessible is so baked into the design or the code that, you know, it is usually the documentation that can really sort of say how accessible something is or what was, you know, brought into it, right?
Yeah.
So it does make sense that design systems are setting, although it does make me go, why don't product teams document better? But
well, yeah.
That's a topic for another day. Cool. And so another good question here from Matthias. How do you manage and I suppose maintain quality of your component usage with the design system when it goes out into the wild? Do you?
Oh, that's yeah. As in, how does
basically making sure that people stick to what you're doing. So I suppose it's harder when it comes to code because I suppose people can't really, you know, detach instance like they can in design. So it's
yeah. So there's no easy solution for that. I think you do have to constantly be kind of checking up on individual teams and periodically working with them. So one of the things that I think is important is that a piece of code, a component, or however you want to slice it, that is a likely candidate for the design system, which was may have been developed somewhat in a product team. It's best to avoid obviously just saying, oh, okay, well that seems like this component you happen to have devised before anyone else should be in the design system. So just put it in, but to actually actively coordinate it being part of the design system, and in the process make sure that it is of the highest quality. So it's about that things being contributed to the design system. There's an opportunity to coordinate and make sure that they're of the highest quality. So if they are lacking in accessibility, for example, then you can fix that in a collaboration with those people who are contributing, and then you end up with a better component in the design system, and then they're drawing back from the design system anyway, so they get a better version for themselves. So hopefully there's that kind of feedback loop, and the collaboration is a word that comes up a lot recently around product teams and the design system working together over things. Yeah.
And I suppose it's interesting as well on like a similar note. I suppose when you're working with a component that is going to affect or potentially affect, because there are some components when you touch them, you were talking about it before, the cascading effects that you can have throughout sort of the entire system can be, you know, quite far reaching. Do you currently use any kind of like visual regression testing or anything like that to sort of, you know, almost like grok the changes when you're working on something so that there isn't that chance of, you know, something looking completely messed up sort of when you know, deliver an iteration or a change to something?
Yeah, so I don't typically use visual regression testing, and the reason for that is that generally, first of all, it's a very difficult thing to get set up, I found. But also,
it is.
yeah, But also I tend to find that it catches more. I mean, this is a wider conversation around testing and the philosophy of testing, but it tends to catch more changes that you wanted to make than it does ones that you don't. And then it's sort of filtering through the stuff which is actually no, that's just me doing my job. Can you please stop? You know, I mean, I remember working on a design system where I was just constantly refreshing my snapshots, you know, your snapshots in Jest. This is like, well, so now I've got two jobs. My actual job, which is to change this component for the better, and then to tell this system, no, I know what I'm doing. Can you please remember it differently again? So it's like another command each time. I'm being a little bit facetious around testing, but I find it can be a bit of an impediment with that stuff, and especially with visual regression testing. Usually, like if there was a way of visual regression testing where it didn't just tell you when it changed the way it looks, but it was able to pick up on specific things you'd want to avoid, like say parts of it becoming obscured, like the text going off the screen and things which are actually an accessibility issue or that kind of stuff. That, I mean, we're getting into the territory of AIs again, probably, aren't we, in order to do that kind of thing.
But so, at the same time, like it is, I see that feels like a much better candidate for, you know, good AI and stuff that can actually, you know, use sort of machine learning to build up that knowledge of what is acceptable, what is sort of unacceptable in the boundaries.
Yeah.
If it's in testing or something, which feels like a, you know, a lot less sexy for when people are trying to get investment, but geez, way more useful than AI image generators.
Yeah, I think so. So if anyone is a VC here, Luke and I are looking for some funding for our new visual regression testing, but find the stuff that is bad. Well, that's what we'll call it. That's a catchy name, isn't it? So yeah.
So I think we have time for probably one last question. So I'm actually going to skip to a good question from Dean, which is actually a follow-on to somebody else's question. So you might have to wrap up both. But so Nuno did ask around, you know, what the most important things were when it comes to accessibility with apps, which I think is a very broad question. But I think Dean has kind of gone in a little bit harder on what you think are the important things to document from an accessibility point of view to ensure that accessibility is considered beyond the design system and into the end product.
That's a good one. So I'm afraid I'm gonna be the irritating guest who kind of changes the nature of the question in order to make it suit the way I answer it. But I'm hopefully I'm doing that I'm gonna do this in a reasonable way. So I think it's really important the way that accessibility is documented for the greatest impact in those terms. So anything there are things which are definitely cause more harm to larger and more varied demographics than other things. There's things which are technically accessibility errors, even in terms of WCAG, where it's like it's not really going to stop the person using the product, where there's others which are much worse. So obviously you want to focus on getting the basic stuff or the more potentially more damaging stuff right first. But it's in the way that you document accessibility in a design system. The mistake that lots of design systems make is, and you can sort of tell that they don't have a kind of core competency in terms of accessibility when they do this, is to just have a kind of pro forma page which says accessibility is blah blah blah, and then some kind of very generic basic information about accessibility. It's really important, just like with the auditing, the providing guidance that I was talking about before when I've done accessibility audits. Really important to organize the advice around the actual components. And in terms of design system documentation, I'm talking about having, when you're talking about color, also mention the accessibility of color, rather than You talk about colors on one page, and then tucked away on a different page labeled accessibility, you say, contrast is good or whatever. So it's kind of, it's actually mentioning it in line. And it's also good, doing that is also really good because it sets the mindset, it sets the expectation that accessibility is just part of the work you're doing, or part of the work that has been done, that makes the component what it is. It's not an extra consideration. It's not a separate consideration. Yeah.
It's exactly, I suppose it's very similar to what we're talking about, design systems as infrastructure. It's almost like accessibility as a core part. It's why I've loved seeing accessibility folks being part of, a platform, sort of design platform team, or a core design team, because it shows that this is a central part of what is important with design. So it's like, let's, recognize that and let's bake it into the way that we do things. I mean, to be honest, I just prefer it if every single designer had to do a 3-year course on accessibility, but I don't think that's particularly realistic.
But hopefully they'll get, if you're dotting that kind of information around everywhere, then they can't avoid it. Like they're going to come across it, and they're going to see that it is part of the day-to-day considerations.
Definitely.
Hopefully that slightly side-angled way of approaching that question was all right.
I think that was great. And I think that's probably a really good point to wrap it up as well. So thank you so much, Heydon, for joining us.
Yeah, no worries. It's been really good.
It's been another great DesignOps Island Discs. It's thank you to the lovely audience as well for the questions. I kind of wish that we could get through more of them. And Amy, thank you to the audience and Amy for the questions. I'm actually going to collate those questions and see if I can shoot them across to you, Heydon, because I think there's some interesting things that might prompt some good.
I love that. Yeah, anything like that. I mean, it gets me thinking about things. I like people asking me stuff about accessibility, like if they contact me on, well, what would now be Mastodon, because a lot of the time it's stuff where I haven't thought about it necessarily, or I haven't thought about it recently. So it gets me thinking about it. So do pass them on, and I'll have a look.
Brilliant. Well, we'll now set you afloat to your island so that you can continue listening to your psych rock, searching for psychedelic beer ingredients. So you can find Heydon on Twitter at HeydonWorks. I believe you're also at HeydonWorks at Mastodon Social on Mastodon.
Barely on Twitter now. So I've technically got an account, but I'm not really using it. So find me. I'm a front end social on Mastodon, and I'm just Heydon on there.
Brilliant. And you can also have a look at all the amazing things that Heydon does at his website, heydonworks.com. As always, this podcast is brought to you by Zero Height, the design system documentation platform. So you can jump in if you would like to and create your first style guide for free by heading over to zeroheight.com/podcast. If you put the /podcast, they'll know that I sent you, and my bosses will be happy. Until next time, bon voyage.